And a genocide, as we lightly mentioned earlier on, is a really difficult concept, issue, crime, everything. And it's pretty important to have always at the back of our minds an understanding of why it is so difficult, but ultimately why it is so important. And it's difficult because, putting it bluntly and in a way that is unappealing, particularly to victims, all too possibly it never should have been made a crime. Why? Because it's almost, but not actually, impossible ever to prove it as a crime. It became a crime, arguably, because of particular cynical actions by the great powers at the end of the Second World War, by which time Raphael Lemkin had formed the concept of genocide as a sociological concept, sufficiently powerful for it to be used in the genocide, in the Nuremberg cases following World War II, as a descriptive term, but not as a legal term. In that trial, the great powers of the United States and Great Britain and others, in drafting the indictment, defined crimes against humanity, the crime that was charged, in terms specifically narrowed to save them, America in particular, as Jackson, the prosecutor, makes completely clear, to save them from being pursued for bad things that they had done against their own populations. Probably he had in mind the lynching of Black Americans, but he may also have had in mind the historic attempts to annihilate Native Americans. And it was, according to some, and William Shabas is one author who writes on this, it was with seeing how international crime was being dealt with in this cynical way that led Lemkin to take his sociological concept, go off to New York, and single-handedly and brilliantly to have the Genocide Convention constructed and then indeed ratified before his death a few years later. And it's a fascinating story of one man's ability single-handedly to change the lexicon of all educated people and indeed to change the way we think. But arguably it emerged because America at the London Conference in 1945, where Great Britain no doubt took part and no doubt agreed, because there's plenty in the history of British colonism, notably, which might easily rank as the gravest of crimes. At that conference, where it was agreed that war crimes should be very narrowly constructed, and narrowly constructed in such a way as Lemkin realized that without a war on which, and without war crimes to which to link every allegation of crime, it would not be possible to pursue, say, the Nazi regime simply for the extermination of the Jews within their own territories and without a war going on. And this background is something we all need to at least know about. And thus it is that it's always been possible to argue that genocide is an inconvenient crime. And you can develop that argument, although I no longer hold it at all as right, to say, without genocide as a crime, we could have dealt with far more alleged war crimes cases, because genocide consumes an enormous amount of legal argument and factual analysis. And what's more, we could arguably have led to a fairer public discussion about mass atrocities, because at the moment what tends to happen is if a mass atrocity can be labeled as genocide, it gets attention. If it isn't labeled and can't be labeled as genocide, it gets less attention. But in fact, crimes on both sides of that divide, or mass atrocities on both sides of that divide, may be quite as bad one as the other. And it's always worth remembering that things like the Twin Towers in New York was never a genocide. Or if somebody was to let off a dirty bomb in London, an atomic device in London, and render large parts of the city uninhabitable and kill many, many people, that would not be genocide. So those are all the background problems. But the people were given the term, and people use the term. And the law belongs to the people. It does not belong to lawyers and politicians who may be manipulative in what they do with the law. And having been given the term and having a sense of what it means, citizens, and in particular, citizens of the world, and in particular victims or those who are related to victims, want the word to be used. And they're entitled to that, in my view. And therefore, the rest of us who have the skills that may be necessary should do all we can when called upon to see whether events meet the very narrow definition of genocide. Narrow, because it requires proof of a very particular mental state, either in an individual or where you're dealing with genocide by a state, the mental state of the leadership of the country or the whatever it is concerned. And those problems existed in respect of, or at, the tribunal. Those conceptual problems existed in the workings of the tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and had sometimes quite serious consequences for us. Internal politics are not really very interesting, perhaps for most of you, but it was interesting in the case of Srebrenica to see what this crime does to people, or thinking about this crime does to people. Remember, the office of the prosecutor in The Hague was mostly youngish people, probably the majority under 40 from different disciplines, almost none of them with direct connection to the conflict itself. Some may have had family members. And when I got there to do this case in 2001, the end of 2001, there were already 3 different trial teams dealing with the 3 different conflicts, Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo, with 3 different team leaders. The teams did not get on well together. They certainly didn't want to have somebody brought in over the top of them to run the whole show. They didn't share information. And what had happened was, and there's absolutely no criticism in this, that the Kosovo indictment had not included genocide, where on reflection, quite probably it could have done, and even one could say should have done, because the genocidal evidence for Kosovo is pretty good. The Bosnian indictment had included genocide. And again, no criticism for that. And it was to be expected that the genocide allegation would appear somewhere, given that it had been included as a possible crime to charge in the statute of the tribunal. One day, I found a meeting was organized behind my back by the Bosnian team, with the chief prosecutor present, but apparently not me. But I heard about it and went into it and discovered that the office was being divided fiercely and with unpleasant argument about whether genocide should be included in the Bosnian case. Irrational to be so unpleasant, fierce, but that's what this crime could do to people who gave themselves importance, or indeed maybe were important, in forming the way this trial should be conducted. Happily, the judges had decided to, not happily generally, but for this particular issue, the judges had decided to take the Kosovo trial first. So there was plenty of time for me to think a bit more about Bosnia. And because I had very short period of time to get into the case. I arrived in November and we started the case in the following February. And so I was always in a state of catch up in the early months or years even. And so we took a very measured approach to the problems we were facing and had every single piece of evidence that could be made available brought out of people's drawers, where they sometimes kept a little bit of secret information to try and exercise internal office power. Horrible, but true. We got all the evidence out, we analyzed it, we then had another long process of analysis, and we decided that there was indeed evidence sufficient to argue genocide. And again, it's absurd to know this, not absurd, it's extraordinary to know that as a result of this decision that was made, internal decisions were made to throw people off the case because they couldn't fall in with, or was thought not to be able to fall in with a process of rational decision-making. Very strange. And when we reached the end of the prosecution's case and arguments were raised by friends of the court about the sufficiency of the evidence for genocide, the three judges, one of whom was a replacement for Judge May, who had been the presiding judge and who was found to be very ill and died very shortly after the end of the prosecution case. So the three judges decided that there was sufficient evidence to go forward for genocide in a straightforward form against Milošević in respect of events in eastern Bosnia. The third judge dissented on that, but they all three agreed there was sufficient evidence to go forward, if you like, requiring the defendant to answer the case in lesser forms of genocide. And you can see all this in a document called the Decision on Acquittal, or 98 bis. We'll give you the reference to that if any of you would like it. So let me just look at a couple of questions. Francesca, you ask, why did people want to exclude it? It's hard to remember because precisely the reasons, but it was almost philosophical. People were saying, you know, you can't possibly find the mental state of the intent to prove an intention to kill or destroy a group in whole or in part. And one of the fiercest opponents of adding or keeping genocide in the indictment was a colleague of Naina's, not a lawyer, somebody who regarded himself as a high intellectual with deep knowledge of the reason. And he was philosophically opposed to a finding of culpability. He was the chap actually who got moved aside. Yes.
When you finish your story, I have different take on it, which we discussed many times.
Yeah, go on.
But do finish this, because Geoffrey represents everything as a rational, lawyerly approach to evidence of lack of it, but actually the moment you have genocide charges at any court of law, you will have a huge political response to it. So when we started this discussion in 2002, whether to include genocide, you would be surprised that nothing of the debate was expression of the real objectives of these groups that were representing a position. So I will tell you how it seemed from the position of leadership researcher, as it was the job I was doing, and my task was Bosnia. Carla Del Ponte, the chief of prosecutions, and her kitchen cabinet were fiercely in favor of including genocide charges in the Milošević case. Another group, so you would think that they presented and morality and right, legal and political views. But basically it was much more wicked than this position seems on a face value. The other part of the prosecution, including some mid-level investigators, was saying, you can't do it. We don't have enough evidence for this. And when Geoffrey joined the team in November 2001, this whole discussion in 2002 and this particular meeting formed behind Geoffrey's back had one single objective of this group, was fiercely advocating it, to charge Milošević to genocide from 92 to 95, knowing that there is no evidence, so that Milošević is the highest political representative whom we charge for planning and intent to destroy in part and whole, would actually not survive the evidentiary process and the trial. And that would leave a huge, important legal, political, historical mark. So they wanted to go with genocide charges in order to fail. So Geoffrey came, and investigators and people in the field, they say, we don't have evidence. You cannot include the genocide with this thin evidentiary basis, especially when it comes to prove intent, which for intent you go to highest leadership, Milošević and people close to him. So Geoffrey, not being aware what is political intention, and don't ask me why chief of prosecutions was so influenced by direct targeting from those who had political benefit, in this case Belgrade. So Geoffrey looked into the debate and he said to his junior lawyers, give me the evidence for genocide. He looked in the evidence and he said, this is the evidence upon which we are not going to win genocide charges in the Milošević case. So what he did, he came to us and said, you all need to reinvestigate genocide charges before I allow it to be in indictment. So my task was, as a researcher of political and military top leadership, to go, and I spent sometimes 2 weeks of my time in Belgrade, in the heart of everything, looking for documentation and leads that would connect Belgrade, i.e. Milošević, to genocide. And after we satisfied Geoffrey that we have prima facie, that we have enough evidence, he said, okay, we are leaving genocide charges in it. So what happened is that from 2002, we had a special sub-team led by an Australian investigator who did nothing then investigate and continued investigating genocide throughout the trial. We never stopped investigating genocide. So what happened at the end of Milošević case before he died, we had in 2004 this immensely important document, which is in your reading material, and it's called, we call it half-time judgment, where actually at the end of prosecution team, a case and presentation of evidence, defense has a right to reflect back on how strong evidence was and plead for the judges to exclude from the rest of the case those counts that prosecution did not lead enough evidence for that. And this is a historical document because in a half-time judgment from June 2004, the decision by the judges was that prosecution led enough evidence to for Milošević to have the case to answer, so that the test in half-time judgment was that prosecution led enough evidence so that Milošević had to answer these charges in his defense part. And this historical judgment allowed us to think that we will also pass the test that we proved it beyond reasonable doubt, which is another important test that you have as prosecution to pass if you want this confirmation in the judgment of the trial chamber. So what happened is that we were so close to pass this test, not because prosecution did such an excellent, extraordinary job, but because Milošević, as representing himself in the court, did not lead any evidence to refute our charges in genocide in Bosnia, because he was messing up his own defense. So we were actually 3 weeks away from finishing the trial and leading evidence, i.e. Milošević finishing his defense trial, to have then judges go back to genocide charges. And our expectation was that, yes, this trial chamber would probably be inclined to confirm that Milošević as individual was responsible for genocide between 92 and 95 in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then he died. And that was where it finished. So Geoffrey, is it your recollection as well as what I announced?
Yes, I think it's a very generous explanation of my role in it to some extent. Nena knows much more about and is able to infer from her knowledge of the office much more about the internal politics, and I would rely on what she says. But it was, as in all these cases, and I emphasize that, something I'm going to say unconnected to the former Yugoslavia before I finish, it is extremely important to be as calm and as analytical as you can and not to allow yourselves to get carried away. The citizen and the victim does get carried away when they experience or see something that looks as though it must be the worst possible thing that humans can do to other humans. And they say that has to be the worst of all human crimes, and surely the worst of all human crimes is genocide. The lawyer has to be much more analytical than that. I hope you all got somewhere the definition of genocide, but if you haven't, we'll read it out to you in just a minute. I better get the words completely right. But before that, I'm going to answer some of the questions on chat. Then I'm going to move on to a few other things. Nena, do we know, by the way, whether Andrew's got it coming at 10 or not at all? We don't know. Right.
Oh, he just replied. It's refusing me access to Zoom. Can you help? So okay. Bester, can you help Andrew one way or another?
Okay, now, amongst the questions that I see, what are the reasons for excluding genocide? Well, to some extent, I hope, Francesca, we've answered that and come back if we haven't. But it was both political and I think it was also emotional, from what I remember, that for some reason these young people, probably excessively self-important, facing a fascinating problem, would take sides emotionally, which wasn't necessarily a very helpful thing to do. From Lorena, what are the preconditions or factors that should take place for a crime to be considered as genocide? And then from Ruby, what sorts of evidence are required for meeting the burden in cases of genocide? In the literal sense, she asks, I'm wondering what form the evidence takes. Well, it may be helpful, I hope, just to have a completely imaginary case, or to imagine hypothetically what might have happened in a real case. If at the end of a conflict, and there's a famous example of this for those who are English with Agincourt and Henry V, if at the end of the conflict there were a lot of Frenchmen around and captured, the conflict's over, and as it happens, and you decide to kill all of them because you simply because they're Frenchmen. You don't want Frenchmen. You want to exterminate the French race, and that could be genocide. If you do exactly the same act because you don't want to run the risk of those captive Frenchmen becoming fighting soldiers again, then probably it isn't genocide. If you imagine yourself sitting in Milošević's palace with his ministers around him and thinking of the Srebrenica events, remember Milošević was not only was in Serbia, the country next door to Bosnia. Serbia was never at war, and our case against him was that he was having sufficient influence, power, and direction over the Serbs in Bosnia as to be culpable for the crimes they committed. So if you imagine him in his office saying, let's just kill off all those Muslims and get rid of them because I really can't tolerate their existence, that would be one thing. Or something, I mean, it's a primitive suggestion, but I'm doing it for the purposes of argument. On the other, if he says, I just want more space for Serbian people to live in Bosnia and for us all to live together, we Serbs, I'm not concerned about killing people or getting rid of them. I just want more space for ourselves, and I'll do anything that's necessary for that. It might be much more difficult to say that would be genocide. And it's these subtle, unpleasant differences in mental state that determine, or evidence about them, that determine whether something may be or may not be genocide. So when you come to what evidence there is, bearing in mind that you're unlikely ever to catch somebody or find somebody ever saying things in the explicit way I've suggested, you look at what happens on the ground, who is killed, who is forced out of their, in the case of the Bosnia, who is forced out of the place where they lived and for what apparent purpose. You also look at all the things that are said by or on behalf of the leadership that indicate their mental state and what they were intending to achieve. And you put those things together. Where do you find those things? Well, what happens on the ground is a matter of, it emerges from a whole range of evidence. It would be observations from people on the ground, military records of what was done, for example, where you find tanks, for example, once they're out moving, they keep records, they keep diaries. Commanders keep diaries of what they do in war, so you have documents of that sort. In Milošević's case, you also have stenographically recorded records of what was said at meetings where he either directed or had influence over what was happening in Bosnia and being done by the Bosnian Serb military. Then, in relation to what was happening in Bosnia generally by the Bosnian Serbs, you have the pronouncements of the Bosnian Serbs, what they were intending to achieve and how. And then you ask yourself the question, was Milošević a part of what they were saying? Did he sign up to it? did he reject it? And it's a combination of all forms of evidence that you need in order to decide what was done and what was within the mind, or what could be proved to be in the mind of the commanding individual, or indeed the commanding political body. And we decided in the case of Milošević, and the judges agreed with us to the extent they needed to at what Nena has described as the half-time decision. They decided there was plenty of evidence to show both the commission of genocidal acts on the ground and of Milošević being sufficiently associated with that, proved to be part of that, so far as two of the judges were concerned, for him to be potentially culpable of genocide itself. And all three of the judges finding sufficient evidence for him to be culpable of lesser forms of genocide. Now, I said I'd depart from where we are precisely just before coming back to the former Yugoslavia. If I'm right, and I hope I am right, in thinking that it remains appropriate in our world for citizens to have answered questions about whether genocide is being committed, however difficult those questions are to ask and answer, then there are duties falling on states. And where states won't perform those duties, there are duties falling on others to look at some of the worst events that are going on and to say, is there evidence to prove that this is genocide? And so we've been involved in that, one or two of us, in different areas of unhappy conflicts around the world over the last 20 years. The Rohingya Muslim is one example. I'm not involved in the case, although I'm very happy to see that it's being brought. And for those of you who don't know about it, it's a very interesting example of the international criminal law in action. The Rohingya Muslims forced out of Myanmar across the border into Bangladesh may well have suffered persecution, including killings of them within Myanmar, sufficient for the purposes of proving genocide. But there's a problem about bringing them in any way before the International Criminal Court, because Myanmar's not signed up to the International Criminal Court. Bangladesh is. And so one approach to this problem was to look at crimes committed at the border and to ask the question whether it would be possible to say that crimes had been committed that continued across the border, and to bring that matter to international criminal justice attention. Another and far more imaginative route was taken by the country of Gambia. And this brought the matter not to the International Criminal Court, but to the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention. And under the Genocide Convention, if it is thought that genocide is being committed, you can possibly, as a third-party country, bring a country before the court and ask for a ruling in that country, in that court, on whether genocide's been committed. And this is developing law, imaginative law, and we are partway through the process for Myanmar. Other examples, recent and topical, include the killing of practitioners of Falun Gong in the People's Republic of China for the purpose of extracting their organs and selling them on the open market, livers, kidneys, hearts, and so on, in which I and also Nick Vetch, who's I think with us, have been involved. And we were asked to look at the evidence about this and to make findings. And if you read the judgment we delivered in full in March of this year and in summary in June of last year, you'll find that we certainly considered the evidence, all the evidence, as carefully as we could. First, to find out whether these terrible things had happened, and we found that they had and were happening. And then to decide analytically whether they showed a desire by the People's Republic of China to commit genocide against the practitioners of Falun Gong who would qualify as a group for the purposes of the Genocide Convention. And we found that there wasn't enough evidence. And it's very important to be that analytical. There's another issue arising which no country will deal with, and probably no country will deal with, and we'll explain why, which is whether the People's Republic of China is committing genocide against the Uyghur Muslims of northwest China, 1 million of whom are incarcerated in camps. Now, why do I say no country will deal with that? Well, under the Genocide Convention, once a country knows that genocide may be being committed or is being committed, it has to act. And no country is going to want to act against China. The implications for commerce, the implications for the well-being following commercial difficulties if you withdraw from trading with another country are too grave. And so no country will willingly, we think, ever make a finding adverse to the People's Republic of China of genocide at the moment. And that, again, as with the Falun Gong, will demand actions by other organizations, maybe by another citizens group of the type that worked on the Falun Gong. So, always important now to ask the question, and always important to be ruthlessly analytical with the evidence, not least because if you overuse genocide, you will dilute it, such value as it definitely has for the citizenry. I may have got another question from Holly and from Ruby, but I'm going to say one other thing. And then I think, has Andrew joined us yet? Not yet. Naina told you about the internal office politics connected to external politics that she detected in the troubled decision-making about bringing allegations or pursuing allegations against Bosnia, in respect of which we were ultimately, to the extent possible, given that the man died, successful. In another court, the International Court of Justice to which I referred, Bosnia brought a claim under the Genocide Convention, which lasted for 13 years, and was finally brought to conclusion in 2007 with a very, very limited finding adverse to Serbia, and a finding so limited as to be of no real value to the Bosnian people, leaving unresolved the question of the real question of whether and to what extent Serbia had wished to commit and did commit genocide against the people of Bosnia. Wouldn't it be nice if somewhere, someone would try and reopen that question and get the record put right, because there's so much more evidence now, even than there was by 2007. And one of the awful realities of the world is that there was apparently an effort to put it right. Within days of the expiry of the 10-year limit on bringing applications to correct the judgment by the very party that should have sought to correct the judgment, namely the Bosnian state. But that application by the Bosnian state was itself wholly corrupt. It was made quite specifically and in order to fail. The then president of Serbia almost acknowledges, the president of Bosnia almost acknowledges as much. Nena will have observations about what the pressures were on him to launch a dishonest application that contained within it an absolute certain hand grenade that would explode and stop the allegation of the attempt to correct the finding ever getting off the ground. It's enough for us to know that in the world of so-called international justice, the interests of the real victims, a real interest here in having the International Court of Justice decision put right, was corrupted by politics of some kind, whether it was financial or other, doesn't really concern me. It's enough to know that the victims were never going to have that issue properly reopened and properly addressed. So I will come back to specifically to the ICTY maybe in a minute, but all of us should recognize, I think, that until such time, if it ever happens, that people cease to want genocide to be determined as a crime, until that happens, we should approach it that it needs to be determined when it is alleged, and that it needs to be determined on the best of available evidence, detached from emotion. And we need to recognize that states and maybe even courts will be likely to be subject to corrupting political pressures that will make that a very difficult or an impossible task. Holly asks, if it is so difficult to prove genocide, does this mean the boundary for proving it should be lowered? Should they be so narrow? Surely if you have a desire simply for more space, according to the hypothetical, and so kill off the people, that should still count because it equates to ethnic cleansing. Well, ethnic cleansing is not the same as genocide. I don't think that the definition of genocide in the convention is going to change. Indeed, it's hard to imagine that the convention would ever get through again if it were first annulled. And there are advantages in keeping the definition narrow because people want it to be the crime of crimes, and having a very specific and horrible mental intent does serve to achieve that. Others may take different views, and I will hear from them shortly. From Francesca, taking China as an example, could we say that the Genocide Convention and all other human rights conventions will only be implemented if there is a political interest of states? Yes. And China is a ratifier of the Genocide Convention, although with a reservation about answering to the International Court of Justice. And it is at the moment, I think, very difficult, if not to conceive, very difficult to conceive that any state will ever have the courage to take China on. we've put ourselves in a truly, truly difficult position by choosing to trade with China at such a level that we cannot extract from the realities of trade and the benefits that trade bring, and the consequences of trade and commerce. And so I don't see how anyone is likely at the moment ever to take China for genocide or any other crime to an international criminal court. It's more than their life is worth. And it's very interesting to see, for me, that in the terrible things that are happening in Hong Kong, where the rule of law is being taken away from Hong Kongers by new procedures that will allow them to be tried by hand-picked judges, taken away to be tried in the People's Republic itself in Beijing, to be tried behind closed doors. It's noticeable, despite all those terrible things that are happening, that the angry responses of mid-sized nations like our own in England may be angry, but they threaten nothing. And Nena, where are we with, and well, now you correct me, or you identify the president I was referring to, who corrupted the process of the revision of the International Court of Justice Genocide Convention decision, was President Bakir Izetbegovic. Before I come to the other questions from Holly and Amir, Nena, any news about Andrew, and do you want to contribute to what I said so far?
I will have my own presentation and I'm making notes, so I think this should be just straightforward, your story. Okay. And forgive me, all of you, for saying this at the beginning about how the division, who were people for genocide to remain in the charges and those who were against, were actually reversed when it comes to morality and value. Those who pushed for genocide were actually on the wrong side of justice pursuit, because they wanted it to fail. They wanted evidence to be so thin that Milošević and Serbia walks away. And those who were saying, no, 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 seemed and were attacked for lack of morality, empathy, and emotion. But those were actually professionals who truly worried about the face of genocide if used so lightheartedly. And even now, this side who claimed moral high ground to pursue genocide still goes to the outside audience in Bosnia and say that Geoffrey Nice was against genocide charges in Bosnia, which was completely wrong interpretation, because Geoffrey said, and I remember, I didn't know Geoffrey by then, and I remember my conversation to him, and I said, you will have to press the charges for genocide. And then he said, but we need to reinvestigate. And I said, of course you need to reinvestigate. And this was why he still is criticized by the same group that he did not want genocide in. He did not want genocide without evidence on the trial, but what we achieved was absolutely amazing. We achieved it against all odds and so much pressure in the office against Geoffrey's pursuit of new investigation, and 92, Prijedor and North Bosnia area, and connected 92 genocide with 95. We called it genocidal process, and the intent that took place not months, not days ahead, but years ahead. And we had to find documentary, contemporaneous video documentation, and we followed Milošević's public words and words from documents which were hidden from public at that time since 86 onwards. So we had chronology of evolving criminality of Milošević, because Milošević wasn't criminal in 86 when he for the first time adopted this platform. But Milošević, on the way to achieving this geostrategic goal, was step by step crossing the border from manipulative politician to a criminal politician. And this was to prove intent. This is what we needed to concentrate finding evidence on that. And this we did. And the most important monument and remembers for this effort is this halftime judgment by the judges on we call it a motion for acquittal or something like that. So that's official.
Motion for acquittal, yeah.
Yeah.
But then I'm about to finish, but may I, and is Andrew not going to be able to join us?
We hope yes.
Okay, good.
We are giving him, creating ever new emails for him to be able to join us. But you know, your Brexit computers are not working with us so long as.
I want to make a complete diversion for a particular reason, but it's connected to several of the questions, and I'll be sure that we answer Holly and Amma before the end of this morning. If Nena doesn't deal with it, I'll come back to it later. But it's this question of how do you prove someone's mental state? The answer is with very great difficulty, but my goodness, it's important. But now I'm going to go down a side alley because I really want to draw to your attention something else. And the something else has to do with the Black Lives Matter events of recent weeks. I came across a quotation which was shocking, both as to its date and to by whom the quotation was. It relates to, I suppose, colonization and the business of taking colonies. It uses a phrase called "in the manger," dog in the manger, which for those of you not familiar with it means the person who's already in occupation sort of sits there and stays there and claims dog in the manger rights. And I'll read the quotation to you and then I'll explain why you can see how important it might have been. I'll give you the quotation, then the date, and I'll ask you who said it. So the quotation reads like this: "I do not agree that the dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the Black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race has come and taken their place." For those of you not familiar with unacceptable terminology, Red Indians is, of course, Native Americans. The Black people of Australia are the Aborigines, millennia or millions of years present in Australia. And some of them, particularly in Tasmania, hunted as animals to extinction by the settlers. Now, that statement in public by a public figure was made in 1937, just before the Second World War. Who made it?
Nathan knows.
I think someone just said it in the chat as well. I think it was Churchill.
Yeah. Now, the Second World War, so far as we were, the combatants concerned, was a war between civilized powers, developed powers. It wasn't in itself an extermination of the Tasmanian Aborigines. But had it been otherwise, and had Churchill or the Western powers found themselves in the dock for anything that they did, what would you make of the mental state And how could you use this phrase to prove something about the mental state of someone who says of another group of people, describes them in terms of stronger race, higher grade race? What would that enable you to start thinking about the mental processes of, had it been the case, a conflict against such a people? And it's that sort of evidence that can go to show the mental state of people against whom genocide charges will be brought. These days, they will be very careful about ever being caught saying any such thing. But that is a critical, that's an example of the sort of material that would be of value in proving genocide cases.
And Geoffrey, the way you describe it, do you think in the case with Churchill's words, in proving criminal intent for such crimes in genocide, where you have to dehumanize each and every participant as a member of a group, as something less human than we are, do you think that, can you tell whether this was a Church as a lawyer, if you would use it as evidence in the court? Is it important that you then in a court have to prove that this genocidal intent is expression of his true racism, true belief that it is true? Or in the case of Milošević, he knew that he was not a nationalist, but he embraced the nationalist language and language that advanced his political career. Is there any way in the law that you can say, oh, this is a fake intent because we know Churchill is not a racist, but he uses it to suck up to his constituency to win elections? Has the law any genuine way to distinguish die-hard racist in genocidal intent, or in someone, a politician who instrumentalized the racist language in order to gain or remain in power?
Gosh, I think you're asking an extremely difficult question, and the way I instinctively hear it is that it may relate to, or you may be relating it to what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic, good morning, Andrew Cayley. I see you've arrived. Very nice to see
wonderful. You. Good morning, Andrew.
Were there ever to be a mental state crime charged against the present president after he leaves office, and he to say, oh, it's true, I said those things, but it was only to generate support, I never really felt them? What would be the relevant mental state established against him? And I'm afraid I'm out of my depth on that one at the moment. Too complicated.
Thank you so much.